So, with the Rump Parliament kind of establishing their control over Scotland, Ireland, and England, that doesn't mean to say that there weren't political divisions within England itself. So, a bit like the Weimar Republic, how we end up having the Republic being created in the 1920s Germany, and how there were those who kind of opposed the creation of the Republic via the Spartacus uprising, the Cat Push, etc. The same thing ultimately happened under the Rump Parliament from 1649 to 53, so a 4-year period under England in this period. So there are a few radical groups who ultimately then fail, but that's not to say that the radical groups themselves weren't a threat to the stability of Parliament under the Rumps. So the most infamous are the Levellers and the Diggers, obviously we have touched upon in year 12. They had expected religious toleration under the Rump Parliament. However, a number of acts were passed by the Rump in relation to religion. One was the Toleration Act of 1650. This removed the requirement for people to attend church as long as they took part in a religious service each week. So it's up to the population as to which service they went to at what point in the week, and it removed that necessity to attend Sunday church under Charles I. Likewise, tithes. Tithes refer to church taxes which had been imposed under the Stuarts. The Rumps continued to collect tithes, and as such, members of radical groups were then expected to pay towards the upkeep of a church they would never therefore attend. So radical groups such as the Levellers and the Diggers didn't attend the church under the Rump that they had established. They attended their kind of own quirky little churches, but yet they still had to pay tithes, and that kind of annoyed those groups, that they were having to pay taxation on services that they would never use, and that kind of increased their resentment towards the Rump Parliament. The Blasphemy Act of 1650 restricted religious sects who faced severe penalties. So the Rump kind of reacted to the Levellers and the Diggers and the other radicalised groups that started to emerge, and they saw them as religious sects. And the severe penalties would range from fines to imprisonment to execution as an extreme measure. And they also banned kind of group meetings of these religious sects because they felt that that was kind of conspiracy movements starting to emerge against the Rump Parliament. So they did deal with the Levellers and the Diggers quite severely. They also started to censor printed material, which kind of then limited the amount of radical pamphlets that were in production, because what they didn't want was for radicalisation to emerge and expand almost like a domino effect, because that would completely undermine the work that the government were doing. It could potentially restore the monarchy, which is obviously what they're wanting to avoid. They therefore, kind of in reaction to the censorship, also created a government newspaper called Mercurius Politicus, which was launched to defend the actions of the Rump and the policies that they were putting forward. So it's not that different to obviously Nazi Germany, in the sense that whilst the Rumps aren't extremists, they are wanted to ensure that any opposition is dealt with quite swiftly and quietly whilst promoting their own policies. The Act for the Propagation of the Gospel in Northern England and Wales controlled the appointment of the clergy to ensure that they were in line with the church canon laws that the Rump introduced, and that meant that only approved ministers were allowed to preach, and therefore there was no radical clergy members. But in addition to that, they kind of undermined the Levellers and the Diggers by creating the Toleration Act, and this law was required compulsory attendance at church being repealed and ultimately given a wider range of religious freedom. So whilst the church was very heavily monitored by Charles I, which stated that they had to adopt Laudianism and Arminianism, the Rump are kind of saying, we are giving you wider range of religious freedom, which, bearing in mind the Levellers and the Diggers wanted religious toleration, the Rump have given them that, and that kind of then dilutes their support, because what they've wanted has been achieved. It's a bit like how UKIP wanted to leave the EU. Now that that's happening, the support for the UKIP is starting to wane, because their whole message has now been achieved and they don't really have any other kind of agenda to promote. So it's the same with the Toleration Act and the Levellers and the Diggers. The Levellers and the Diggers wanted toleration of religion. The Rump have given that, and as a result of that, their support starts to wane. Likewise, we have the Navigation Act of 1651, and this is to do more so with economics and foreign policy, as imported goods could only be carried by English ships. This removed the Dutch monopoly on trade across Northern Europe and North America. The Rump are kind of fairly aware of the fact that Charles II has gone to the United Providences in isolation, and what they don't want to do is to enable the Dutch to become economically stronger, because they could, they probably won't, but they could offer services to Charles II. So they're wanting to kind of ensure that England has a greater economic stability than the Dutch do. And also there's less opposition to governments if the economy is stable. Now, as a result of these reforms, extremism was largely removed under the Rump Parliament. The army were also successful in suppressing threats from the Levellers. For example, ringleaders were shot in Burford in May 1649. So the fact that the Rump Parliament were kind of taking such extreme action against extremism demonstrates the threat it posed to the stability of the Rump Parliament. But at the same time, the long-term impact of extremism is that it was fairly short-lived. And any kind of agenda that they did want to achieve, the Rump kind of dealt with themselves through their policies. Now, that's not to say that there weren't any failures of the Rump Parliament. There were a number of them, mainly to do with finances. Now, due to a need to maintain a large army, there was a shortfall in tax revenue. So there's still that issue with debt, which the monarchy experienced under Charles and James. So the Rump had to resort to selling crown lands to raise money. So land that used to belong to the monarchy, but still had a shortfall of £700,000 per year in 1653. So debt was still a significant concern for the government. And many of the greater gentry and nobility refused to cooperate with the regime. And ultimately, this meant that under the Rump Parliament, it was mainly the lesser gentry who were in charge. And it was the nobility who felt that they were being undermined by allowing middle-class business owners and landowners to control the country, as opposed to the nobility who'd been born into entitlement. So that created a little bit of tension between the nobility and the gentry, that it was the gentry in charge and not the nobility, because the nobility have been largely eradicated by the dissolution of the House of Lords. The rate of reform also slowed down with time. So clearly the Rump were quick to act when they were first established in 1649 by passing 125 Acts of Parliament. But by 1652, you could argue that extremism had waned, and therefore there wasn't a need to pass new policies as frequently. But in comparison to the 125 acts passed in 1649, only 51 were passed in 1652. And so reform wasn't as speedy throughout the Rump Parliament. It was quick to begin with, but then slowed down over time. And to also pay for warships, the monthly expenditure was £90,000 in their era's money as such. And as a result, that shows that not really a lot has changed under England financially. The monarchy spent a lot of money and was in a lot of debt. Under Rump Parliament, they're still spending a lot of money through paying for warships, and they're still in a lot of debt through £700,000 in shortfall. So what we have to think about as a thinking point was the Rump always destined to fail? Don't forget the Rump has come in, taken over the monarchy, which is now being kind of eradicated. And you have very different perspectives about how the country should be run once Charles is executed, from both Ireland, Scotland and England. So what we need to think about is, could the Rump have succeeded at this point in time, or was it always destined to fail? And that's something you can obviously have a discussion point in class about.